So I'm going to read from the prologue of the book. So this is the present time. Afaf Rahman is the principal of Nurrideen School for Girls in a suburb outside of Chicago. The confessional was peaceful, though not quiet. A piano tune floated from a vent in the ceiling, then a chorus of altos. Miss Camelia's show choir was preparing for the spring concert at Navy Pier. A faint rendition of Adele's Skyfall echoed above Afaf's head. During her brief escapes from her office, she'd sit on the cushioned chair, eyes closed, listening to the melodious voices flowing from the vent. But today, she only had time for prayer. Aside from parent calls that morning, she'd been mulling over a new budget proposal and investigating an incident of plagiarism on a term paper. Hands folded over her stomach, Afaf whispered, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. By her final prostration, Afaf heard a sound like a firecracker. She quickly finished and reached for her two-way radio. Lou must have heard it too. She turned up the volume and adjusted the control. Lou, can you check that noise? Troublemakers again. Over. People around the neighborhood tossed M80s over the school fence on a regular basis. It was a message booming loud and clear. You don't belong here. The vandalism had gotten worse too. Last week, they'd spray painted a pig's head on the field house, and 2 days ago, a beer bottle shattered the window of Mrs. Noel Qadir's art classroom. My husband's been at me to quit, the young pregnant teacher had informed Afaf yesterday, her hijab-trimmed face tight with apprehension. She rubbed her growing belly, waiting for Afaf's reassuring words. We've taken every precaution, Noel, and beyond that, it's in Allah's hands, she told the art teacher, sounding more exasperated than hopeful. It was a script she'd automatically recite, and when a local news van pulled up to report on the latest incident of vandalism, she'd recite another one. We are a religion of peace, not terror. We are Americans too. Defying the board's recommendation, she refused to display more flags, particularly one outside the school's entrance for public view, one to which an assembly of students and parents pledged allegiance during programs and graduation was already prominently stationed in the small auditorium. Is a flag the only proof of patriotism? She'd argued to the board. The radio crackled and Afaf set it back on the lamp table. She remained there on the floor, legs tucked under her, and closed her eyes. Allah gift me with patience, she thought. Eyes still closed, she gave dua for Azmiya so she would do well on her AP psychology test this afternoon. They'd spent last night going over a dozen of Azmiya's handwritten note cards on categories of abnormal behavior. Afaf's cell phone buzzed. Before reading the text, she let her mind drift a moment longer in the supplications for those she loved. She breathed deeply, whispered a final dua for her mother, who lived thousands of miles away, yet still managed to disrupt Afaf's sense of confidence. She'd weathered years of Mama's undulating disapproval or complete indifference. Before she could text back, another explosion rattled the light bulb above Afaf's head. She scrambled to her feet. The round of firecrackers sounded closer, as though coming from inside the building, from the floor above her, Miss Camelia's music room. Afaf looked up at the vent, her heart thumping. The singing halted above her. She snatched the two-way radio, her fingers trembling so badly she almost dropped it. Lou, come in, Lou. Gunshots, over. High-pitched, wordless noise roiled from the ceiling. Young girls screaming. Terrifying and unfamiliar sounds, so unlike the swell and dip of laughter. Sounds that had lovingly crystallized in Afaf's heart over the years she'd been teaching at Nurrideen School. Then came loud thuds, like bags of cement dropping to the floor. Afaf leaned against the door, obscuring Gabriel's wings as he hovered over Mary. Clutching the two-way radio, she listened, her face tilted up toward the vent. And that's the end of the prologue. It's actually, this Islamic school was once a church. So she's actually in the confessional. So there's still a mural depicting the Annunciation of Mary.
Thank you so much, Sahar. One thing I forgot to mention, everybody, please feel free to use the chat function to respond to anything that the moderator or the author are saying, and you can drop in your questions for Sahar Mustafah there as well. Anisa, let's take it away with your first questions.
Wow, that's amazing.
Thank you.
So a couple of questions I had for you. So what inspired you to write this book?
I always say it's such a tragic inspiration. In February 2015, 3 young Muslim Americans were shot in cold blood by their white neighbor, and that is Yusor Abu Salha, her husband and her sister. This particular event rattled me, as it did many, as it continues to do so. But it was different from the kind of gun violence that I was sort of preoccupied with as a high school teacher. So the kind of, gun violence that is triggered by bullying, young people who feel really disenfranchised, who then decide they're going to bring a gun to school. This particular shooting was rooted in hatred and bigotry and fear. And I just, I wanted to get close to understanding, how someone decides to, pick up a gun and, go to their neighbor's door. And, fiction, it just feels like this, amazing place to explore those things. And, I can tell you, Anisa, I don't have any answers. You know what I mean? Like that's the other thing. I think fiction, if anything, probably creates more questions. But it's necessary, because that then, creates conversation. So that basically is the genesis of the book.
So if you had a chance to restart your life over, would you still choose to write this book?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Yes. Now, and here's the thing. If it hadn't been that particular shooting, I was just thinking about, what we've witnessed ever since, in terms of mosques being basically places of massacres, as we saw in New Zealand. So, what I think? It might be inevitable. But I want to attach to that how I'm also at a point where I felt like I needed to expand the narrative around Muslim and Arab communities. So I think I also just sort of wrote the book that I wish, I could have read, because it is framed by this hate crime. But, what readers discover very quickly is, oh, this is the story of actually a human being. And we go back in Afaf's life, starting when she's only 10 years old. And I wanted to present to an audience a very complex, nuanced community, that basically has been conflated with really destructive and terrible things. So that felt like a responsibility. And I have to be honest, Anisa, I was really, the community that I kept seeing in my head was my Muslim and Arab community. And they were the ones who I was so concerned about their reaction to this book. And it's just been so well received. I'm so happy. So, and I guess we can talk about that a little later, but it became this thing of, this still might be a unique story, but it feels like here's one more book to expand the narrative, right? It can't be, and then it can't be the only book that people pick up. So, you know what I'm saying? But that's also an industry thing in terms of how limited we are, in terms of our voices getting into the mainstream.
So have you read books by other Muslims?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, you know what? I am pretty devoted to writers of color, but particularly, Arab and Muslim writers. So, if I were to make a quick list, I really love Leila Lalami, the Moroccan American writer. I also love Leila Abu Lila, who is Sudanese, if I'm not mistaken. And I think, let me see, I'm trying to go back to first, those early voices. I'm thinking of, oh gosh, Noelle Sheikh, is that her first name? But that I read in English, translated from Arabic. And I'm sorry. I think I might have gotten her first name wrong. So yes, but I think that again, when I was in college, and I've been out of college for years. I'm 47 years old. These were also authors I had to seek out on my own. So they were never presented, in the canon. And I've been pretty lucky because I'm also part of an Arab American writing community. So I've also been able to connect with others' works in that way, and also poets, and I'm sorry, there are so many more, that I can list, but yes, to answer your question, I try to make that, a priority.
So in your book, what author or book inspired you?
You know what? I don't think there's a single book that I could point to. I think maybe before this novel, my short stories were probably influenced by other writers, but this really felt, well, I hadn't heard a book, based on something like this before. The only thing that I can think of that might have come close in terms of Muslims is Camila al-Shamsi, who is a British Pakistani author, and she wrote a beautiful book, and it's on my shelf here, Home Fires, in which a young woman's brother becomes entangled in a terrorist network, and she's trying to basically bring him back. And I just felt like she was so unapologetic in the way she presented these different characters, and I thought she was also unapologetic in terms of offering a hopeful or a happy ending, and I really appreciated that. So she, I guess, yeah. And then I'm thinking of Raja Hasib. She wrote A Pure Heart, which is also about Muslim characters. In fact, it's about two sisters. So I've been definitely influenced, but I'm not sure that, I was thinking of other stories necessarily. I've just been really, again, just privileged to know that, okay, there's a space for my book. Here are these other writers who have gotten into the mainstream, who are they're basically with the issues. It felt very hopeful. Like the white gatekeepers were finally, getting wise about what we want to read, basically.
So what was the writing process for your book?
So I actually had finished my master's in fiction writing just a few years before, but that was for a short fiction collection called Code of the West, which I'm grateful. It was actually, that one was published through an independent publishing house that are devoted to writers of color. So I was lucky it won a prize and it's in the world. But the writing of a novel was a new experience. The only thing that, I can say was similar is that this book is episodic. So it felt like a good and easy transition. So because I present Afaf in decades of her life, and then it's interspersed with the shooter who remains unnamed, but his chapters are much, much shorter. That felt good. So I felt like, okay, I could still tell a whole story, and yet it will hopefully would seamlessly, take us into her next journey. And I'm glad because readers have said, they could have maybe done without the shooter. And he's deliberate though. I'll talk about him in just a second. But they felt like, they always felt that transition was smooth. So they felt like they were right back with Afaf, even though years had passed. So we go from her being 10 to her being, I think at that point she's about 18, she's about to graduate. And then we see her in her 20s. So it was typically about 10-year, spans that I was doing. But so the writing process, I mentioned the MFA because I was feeling sort of these post MFA blues, you know, so to speak. And I knew that if I was going to write this novel, I'd need the community to read me. So I needed to get back. And I found this wonderful program that is housed in Story Studio Chicago, which is this wonderful storytelling community. And Rebecca Mackay, who is an award-winning novelist, she was the one who ran a program or a cohort called Novel in a Year. So it sounded really catchy. And I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to go through it and see what happens. So I managed to produce an exploratory draft, which actually sort of flopped. So Afaf did not come into play, into my vision, until I went through a draft. So she was not part of that very first one. The shooter, I could see absolutely clearly. So he never really changed. I just had to think about characters that could sort of carry this vision of mine to present, again, our community in this really nuanced, complicated, complex, and just this really beautiful and rich way. And I realized, oh gosh, instead of focusing on multiple main characters, I just need one. And then Afaf was born. I could see her clearly because I also could see her as a little girl. And I realized I'd have to go back to the beginning. So I present her in present time at the beginning, but then we're on a journey with her. And we get to see, you know, all the forces, all of the stories, all of these things that carry her to where she ends up facing the shooter. You know, she comes to see, they are basically face to face. And I don't think I'm giving away too much there, but it gets pretty tense. So yeah, I you know, having that writing community was super. And then I just started redrafting, and it went, you know, pretty quickly. I'm a pretty fast writer when the story is working. You know, I wake up very early because I teach high school. So I'm up at like 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was just, you know, the pages were, you know, just flying, which I was really happy about. That's not to say, you know, that always happens, but you know, it's working, you know, even before I you know, cause I don't outline a whole lot. I just start to, you know, let the story sort of guide me, and then I'll step back, and then I do my research. And then of course I begin to look at chapters very, you know, critically, and making sure that, you know, I'm transitioning, and, you know, scenes are pretty well rounded, and, you know, all that other stuff.
So is Afaf's personality from your personal connection, or it's just general people you know?
You know, I have to say that it's a question, and I don't know, Anissa, you didn't necessarily say if it, you know, is it autobiographical? I really sort of resent that in other audiences, because there's this, you know, I don't know what it is about, you know, writers of color and typically white audiences wanting it to be autobiographical. It's almost like, and, you know, I've heard this term a lot this year, trauma porn. So, you know, that sort of like, they want to know that, you know, I suffered and I went through this, and it's not me. There's one character who I might say is probably more like me, and that's the brother, who's a complete, he follows the rules. He's a good student. I was kind of the nerd. But it's a good question, Anissa, because yes, it is probably an amalgam of a lot of different experiences, but then also stories of other people's experiences. For example, when we open up, when she's in 1976, her sister disappears. And I just remember growing up and very vividly remembering, and I grew up in Chicago. I lived in Palestine for some years, but was mostly raised in Chicago. And I just very distinctly remember my sister's best friend just showing up on our stoop, bawling, and her sister had taken off, you know. So that memory is quite visceral, and it was just you know, an example of a handful of stories of, you know, sort of this failed assimilation, you know, back in the 70s and the early 80s, and young, you know, first generation, second generation, just really struggling, you know, to fit in and to belong. And, you know, and the thing about assimilation that is pretty destructive is it's like this one-way commitment. It's like the migrant has to basically, you know, leave everything behind because America's not going to, you know, concede. And, you know, a lot of families have been fractured by that kind of thing, because I just remember in my own family, my parents very desperately wanting us to hold on to their heritage, you know, but then feeling the pressure of white America, you know, because nowhere in my experiences when I was younger did anyone ever say, so what do you celebrate, Sahar? So, you know, where do your parents come from? It was mostly, nope, you leave that behind. You're either with us or you're not, you know, that kind of mentality. So I think Neda's character is sort of emblematic of that. So yeah, I would definitely say, you know, we write what we know, but I definitely fictionalize. So there shouldn't be too many characters. I hope my sisters will tease me about that they recognize, but they certainly will be, they'll send me texts and say, wow, that just reminded me of blank, you know, so it will be familiar. And even for people who don't know me, will say, I recognize these stories. I recognize these characters, you know, in my own life.
So during your schooling, have you faced any discrimination or like any Islamophobic, and how did you overcome it?
So one story that I actually like to share, I teach seniors. So right now we actually just finished their personal statements that they're going to be sending off to, you know, to their colleges and college applications. And actually I'm going to be telling the story as part of another storytelling event at the end of the month. When I was a junior in high school, I enrolled in an AP class, and it was mostly, you know, white students who were in this class. And I look back now and I can see that it was because the other populations were not very much encouraged, which makes me really sad as a teacher, especially. So I think it might've been one other brown person in the room. So our first assignment, just so the teacher could gauge our writing ability, she had us write a review, and I just loved beaches. And I think you're probably super young, and obviously you're also still a college student, Anissa, but it was the movie Beaches, which is this really sappy, it's Bette Midler. And, you know, she has a friend who's like, they have a whole lifetime of experiences together. And I just loved it. So I was excited. So I wrote it and I turned it in. And when we were handed back our papers, she had written F and then had scratched that out and had written B, and then in just, you know, blood red ink, are you familiar with the word plagiarism? And, you know, I just, you know, it was horrible to say the least. So she keeps me out of class and she says, oh yes, I did think that you plagiarized, but then I talked to one of your English teachers and she confirmed that you write like this. So of course, the humorous part is I'm like, okay, but you still gave me a B? I mean, you thought that I plagiarized a professional, you know. And can I tell you, Anissa, that really, it devastated me. And I share that story with my high school students because I talk about how I was disillusioned by an adult for the very first time. So it was an adult telling me that because of who you are, I don't think you can do the work, and not even giving me a chance. So I remember having very positive experiences with teachers, and then even white teachers who really just elevated and advocated. But that was the first time a teacher knocked me down. So other experiences were, you know, things that were microaggressive were the neighborhood bullies, you know, camel jockey, terrorists and things like that. And things that I guess I sort of expected from kids our age, but then not from adults, right? And I have to be honest, I still continue to feel like I have to, you know, make sure that everybody knows that I deserve my place at the table, that I have earned it. So, and I know it's because of a lot of things that I've internalized in terms of, again, you know, the sort of what people consider harmless, microaggressive. And I'm glad because I feel like my daughters, I have 2 adult daughters, they are better at, you know, challenging that and combating that, where I could say, you know, approaching 50, and forgive me, I put up with a lot of shit, you know what I mean? But, you know, I look at how in the 90s, it feels like for me, that's when there seemed to be like this beautiful flourishing of women wearing the hijab and putting that on, you know. And then unfortunately 9/11 happened, and some of them, you know, had taken off, but not all of them. So I hope I've answered your question, Anissa. Sometimes I go off on tangents. So yeah, definitely. And even, you know, my own students will have presumptions about me, but I'm happy because we get to have a conversation, so I can help dispel that, you know. And it's ignorance. It's like, if you've only had, you know, one particular experience with someone, and that's the only one, then you've created what Chimamanda Adichie calls that the danger of the single narrative, right? Stereotypes are true, she says, but they can't be the only story. And that's what I hope I presented in this book.
That's beautiful.
Okay.
I mean, also like teachers, they always have a big impact in our life. Like, the same thing happened to me through a teacher too.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. And I think too, Anissa, it's like we are almost, you know, we're obligated. We're, especially in this moment, after George Floyd, after Breonna Taylor, we need to be having these conversations. But I still have colleagues who are like, race has no, you know, place in the classroom. And it's like, you're so wrong. And then what are those messages that you are inadvertently sending, you know, to your young students? It makes me sad. I hope I'm doing the best I can, you know, with these seniors.
You are, with providing a book too.
Yeah,
like all the team.
They've been pretty excited. Yeah. They think by the way, they think like I'm going to disappear. And I'm like, you guys, unless Oprah calls, I'm here. Unless I get a movie deal, I'm here, you know? So it's been great though. I tell them, I'm like, you can have more than one life. You know, you can cultivate your passions. It doesn't have to be one thing that you do.
Amazing. So, sorry. Can you talk about the choice to write from the attacker's perspectives?
Yeah.
Why did you do it? What challenged you to do it?
So let me tell you something interesting first. When I was submitting this manuscript to agents, the biggest note of rejection was the shooter. So almost every single editor and agent loved Afaf. They loved her story. But what I was trying to present by even, you know, framing her narrative through hate crime is basically that daily threat that the Muslim community faces. It might not be this heinous or fatal, but I think about, and I can only imagine what it's like to be visibly hijabi going out in the world, especially in this climate, right? It's just so horrible. And I had not even started to imagine Donald Trump, you know, when I had started writing this. But, you know, just like the inspiration and other stories that we've heard of these hate crimes, you know, it seemed inescapable. So here's the thing though, I'm a fiction writer. And as much as I wanted to get close to Afaf, I also wanted to get close to the shooter. And it seems like a really strange thing, but I needed to know, again, you know, where are you in your life? What have you brought to this moment in time that you would pick up a gun and go into a school and basically, you know, shoot, you know, innocent girls? And in doing that, maybe again, trying to get close to the bigotry, the fear and the hatred that, you know, assaults us in this country. So that was the experience, a very personal one that I wanted to engage. And I know some audience members, you know, I think even people who are even looking at my book maybe on the shelf, they're worried that it's going to be graphic, and it's really not. It's disturbing. And I did have, you know, there might be a graphic detail or two, but it really is getting at, you know, again, what creates a killer? You know, what creates a radicalized domestic terrorist? And that's what he is, you know. I can't help but say that that I found very compelling. I'm not justifying behaviors here at all, but I think storytellers always try to get at, again, what are the stories that we carry to this point in time? If we had more opportunities to hear them and to listen, I think we would be a better society, you know? So again, doesn't justify this horrible crime, but when people read the book, I think they're going to get a sense of, oh, okay, so this is where he starts to go off the rails, right? And that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think I am done with, I think that's all questions I've had.
What we can do now is turn to some of the questions in the chat, because there's still a ton kind of in there that we can work towards.
Great.
So I'm going to scroll up a little bit. Wow, we've been asking a lot of questions. Anissa, do you want to start with them, or do you want me to ask them?
You can ask them.
All right. Thank you so much, Anissa. You did that.
Anissa, thank you. Your questions were great. You know, I felt like they also covered a lot.
Thank you for being here.
Okay, we're about to cover a lot of terrain with these other questions, and please feel free to keep dropping in questions into the chat. One thing that you had mentioned is that you had an Arab American writers community. And I was wondering whether this was like an official thing, like Canto Mundo for Latinx writers or Canem for African American writers that you can point people to, or whether it's just like, yo, me and my friends got together and we like hashed it out.
I love it. I'm actually going to also type it here, Willie. So I'm going to do that to everyone. And thank you to everyone who has joined us here. So Radius of Arab American Writers is actually the formal, you know, community. And we go by Rawi, American Writers. I actually served, and I'm just going to type rawi.org. I actually was a board member for many years. And if folks are familiar with Naomi Shihab Nye, she's one of my favorite Palestinian American. Yes. So I had the distinct pleasure of meeting her. I was such a fangirl. Like, this was like 20 years ago. And I met her at a conference for teachers of English. And, you know, the next time I saw her, I did this really, you know, ridiculous thing where I brought my stories, which were not good. I look back and I'm like, boy, those were terrible. And I said, Naomi, what do you think? And she's like, you know, Sahar, you need to connect with this group. And so Rawi has been around, and we've evolved for sure. But if anybody's interested, please check them out. That was my first community. And it was the first place where I'm like, there are others like me, hooray. And, you know, I was so happy because besides connecting, you know, they can be a great support in terms of, you know, just mentorship and then programming. I know COVID has really just sort of stalled a lot of, you know, our connections, but that's my Arab community of writers.
And thank you so much for sharing that, because finding communities with people who share your experiences, I feel like is one of those crucial steps, especially for a writer of color. Otherwise, like, you're frequently getting like criticisms and feedback to your writing that just come from people who don't understand your experience to begin with. So that's part of the reason I wanted to kind of draw back to that question. Another question I had is, how do you see your book fitting into the very contentious debate around gun control and mass shootings in the US? That's one of the things that struck me about this book initially when I was looking into it, is that, you know, it's a very ambitious thing to try to capture what it's like for a community to suffer something as like violent and just traumatizing as that. So how do you see your book fitting into the debate? Yeah, what were your thoughts as you were approaching it from that angle?
Yeah, you know, I have to say, and I don't want to tempt fate here, but I was expecting, you know, some hate mail, you know, from you know, from the gun lobbyists, but that hasn't been the case. In fact, I'm so happy to say that the reception has been wonderful. But in terms of gun violence, I think this, you know, presents, you know, the very human, you know, story behind the victims, you know, of a country that will put the rights of gun owners over, you know, the lives of their citizens, and it's just absolutely terrible. So we find that, you know, in this particular novel, he has very easy access, you know, and we also find that because he is white, he is able to move in spaces so easily. So when he comes into the school, we discover, wow, the security guard doesn't even ask him for any identification and just assumes that, you know, he's this repairman. So yeah, I think, you know what, I think it would be a great, you know, supplement to that. And I think, you know, this is like one of the worst case scenarios of here's how a gun, you know, can wreak havoc on lives, on innocent lives, you know. So, you know, I welcome anybody who wants to debate that. I think, again, this is just one more sort of affirmation of we need to do better. We need to put, you know, human lives ahead of, you know, these really ridiculous policies that privilege white patriarchy, you know.
Mm-hmm. And then this question kind of builds on to what we've been discussing, and you've already mentioned a few of these, but just generally, what fears or hesitations did you bring to writing this book? And I guess I would add on, yes, how did you overcome those? I feel like that's definitely one of the greatest challenges as a writer, is like, you're also carrying all your own fears alongside like trying to do justice to a challenging story.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a great question. You know, I feel very firmly, and I really want to impress this upon, you know, writers who are in this gathering. You really need to stick to your vision. You really need to be true to what is calling you, you know, on the page. But I'm going to admit, I was definitely worried. I was concerned about the reception by, again, my immediate Muslim and Arab community, because the narratives have been so limited, and the responses that I got, and I mean like from across the world, because it's in Italy now, and it's also in England, and it is now crossing into other countries based on the Commonwealth and things like that. And I've received beautiful messages of, thank you, you know, you got it right. And I'm like, the whole like got it right, I'm like, that's what I was worried about. But then what does that mean to get it right? And that becomes a burden. And I just knew that if I told this authentically, and if I told it in a really nuanced way, I couldn't do it wrong, you know? So there are also going to be characters in here who are incredibly flawed, but they are going to be one of many in this community. And I have to say, I really enjoyed that. So she even comes, she sort of clashes with her circle of women at the mosque. And I loved writing that chapter because, again, it really falls back on, you know, our own personal morality and judgment. So I loved challenging Afaf in that way. So will that voice stop? No. And I suppose, you know, there are when I can mute it, but I've never not written something that you know, I felt like, oh gosh, that went into the world and I really don't think I feel that way anymore. Or I can't stand by it. Or, you know, I'm so worried about, you know, the backlash. That is just so crippling, I think, to a writer, that you really need to sort of shelf that. And you need to maybe ask yourself, why are you concerned? So are you taking on something that is incredibly volatile and maybe you're not the right person to tell it? I sort of, you know, went through, you know, those feelings and those issues, and felt pretty good, you know, in telling the story.
Yeah, and that's like a process that I think is crucial for like all writers who are tackling like such controversial issues or things that people have strong feelings about, to like make sure that they go through that process of self-interrogating. This next question I think is a toughie. Maybe you'll think it's easy. But how does one balance the Western concept of freedom of speech with problematic incidents such as Charlie Hebdo, which is a recent beheading, I believe, that happened in France? And particularly your views of that as a Muslim author is something that this audience member was asking in a private chat. We're in a time of growing Islamophobia. And then there's incidents like this that like put the community in a lot of tension. So I was wondering, yes, what your take was on that, whether you had anything to kind of talk about that tension between East and West and freedom of speech.
Yeah, I think, this is a really good question. And I don't know that I have, one really great answer. I will say this. Here's what's problematic. First of all, let's look at the term Islamophobia. There isn't another religion or even a group that has any sort of designation like that, which implies an irrational fear of, right? So even that word is just so tragic. And what does that do? That basically is going to inflate and the fear around a particular event. In this case, I'm thinking of 9/11 in particular. And of course, there have been issues with the East, with Muslims, for decades. But the problem is also that, it's also U.S. foreign policy that has also, I think, sort of created these issues. Now, again, not to justify 9/11 and that terrorism, but, these are, we can look back and say, so here are all the things that have sort of led up to that moment, right? And who suffers? Actual, Muslims who are just trying to live their lives and to raise their children and, to be decent human beings. So the Charlie Hebdo, I think, is so unfortunate, but to me I still feel is isolated. We can look at white domestic terrorism, but we just don't get enough coverage because of, the bias that surrounds, Muslim terrorists. And that is an agenda, and that is very deliberate. And this is the way, white American government and some other, colonial governments will, maintain, powers. And it is quite disgusting. And, I'm just so sad because, again, these are the narratives that are spun. Islam has always been conflated with terrorism. And when we do have an incident like this, and it's a heinous massacre, it's going to gain, global national attention very deliberately. And we tend to then not look at American policy, American foreign policy, and the hatred that we have been fomenting in this country, in the US, for centuries, right? Yeah. I'm sorry, I hope I answered that.
No, that was definitely a really complex question for thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you, yes, for diving in and bringing your perspective. We got two more questions, and I'm excited for both of them. So character development, as we know, is really important for every story. And when writing this book, did you have Afaf's character mostly fleshed out, or did you let her develop and be guided by the story?
I love that. I have to say, it was more being guided. I mean, I had a sense of, here's where she's going to begin, here's where she's going to end. But in between, it really was this wonderful journey. There were also things in the plot that would have shaped, her characterization. But then there were things that surprised me, and that's always so fun. If you are able to see your character very clearly, I think that's a really terrific thing. But I would also suggest being open. So if something is calling, or if you begin to see her or him or they begin to evolve, but you're worried that maybe that might not quite fit with plot development, I would say in those early stages you should really follow those impulses. And when I finally got to my editor, there were things that I had not anticipated. It wasn't until an editor said, what do you think about maybe fleshing this particular, part of her life or decade? And oh boy, it just, brought her story to fruition. And I was really grateful for that. So yeah, with Afaf, I definitely, a little bit of the fleshing out, but then mostly, being on this journey from decade to decade.
And it's such a moving story, I just have to say. Like, I've been really enjoying the past few hours where I've just been buried into it. There's the last question we have, unless people get brave and want to drop their last few questions in the chat. But this one's a really important one, especially for young writers, I feel like. So you've talked about white America expecting you to leave your heritage behind. Do you have any advice for someone about how to find that balance between East and West?
Finding the balance between East and West. You know what? I guess my question is, do you mean in representation in the work, in the written work? Like, because I have to say, one thing that I am, absolutely so much better at, like I look back on my early stories, is I really tried to very quickly dismantle the white gaze. And I definitely have had help, and I've had a lot of guidance, especially through Rawi. I think early on I was writing to a white audience because I felt that if I was going to get mainstream, these might be the kind of stories that might be appealing to them. And it's quite unfortunate, but that was part of my development. So, I will own that. Mm-hmm. But even in this book, I just want to give a quick example of the, East versus West, and maybe this will answer that question. I also will not other my othered characters. So when I submitted a short story to a wonderful journal in Canada, it was a feminist journal, the Indigenous editor said to me, Sahar, we are not going to italicize these Arabic terms. We're just not going to do it. And I felt like my head exploded, because it was the first time someone said, yes, that, and there have been a few other writers who have also commented on this, but there's still writers who continue to italicize, and this is not at all to judge. But for me, I wanted to maintain that sense of authenticity, and to also honor that cultural heritage, and to make it as realistic as possible. And that also has come back in terms of messages from readers, that they felt it was such a natural telling, because there wasn't the italicized, and there wasn't me over contextualizing these things that maybe a white audience doesn't, or a non-Arab or non-Muslim. I definitely don't want to distract my readers, but I'm definitely going to make sure that I am preserving cultural and religious markers.
Yeah, and that's something that I definitely want to applaud about the book, is that especially just beginning it, I was kind of like, there's a sense when you're starting a new work of writing, just how much you trust the author and their vision. And there is something just about the political footing of the book, the sort of ways it was crafting its narrative, that just made me immediately trust the author. Like, there's an author with a very clear vision, and kind of being ready to kind of step into that journey. So I really appreciate that. We've had some book giveaways happen while the chat has been going on. So congratulations
I'm so glad.
to Gaga and to Albert. If you put your contact info so that they can figure out how to mail these books to you, that'll be great. There's one more question in the chat, which I would have a lot of fun with, but I'm curious just how you're going to respond. But any thoughts on Edward Said's book, Orientalism? So, yes.
Well,
thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, like, we have just like a minute or two left, right? Yeah. You know what? I think it needs to be mandatory reading. I think, his work certainly had us, very intimately face, just the devastating and generational trauma of imperialism and colonialism, and how that has also, really infested and has shaped Western literature and portrayals of Eastern culture, particularly Arab, Middle Eastern. I have to say, I've also enjoyed his memoir, Out of Place. So that feels like, I know obviously, Orientalism, we're talking about an intellectual and academic and scholarly work, but I think, his memoir, not to compare, but for me, probably more enjoyable, at least as a reader, because I'm definitely into the journey of human beings, as they are navigating, these cultural and racial constraints. I felt like I was a little bit closer to him, you know, and maybe that's, you know, shallow. I don't know, but good stuff.
I really appreciate you mentioning that. Yes, because when I think about books like Orientalism or some of these other like scholarly giant books, it's like, yeah, they're super helpful, but am I ever gonna read it? I don't know. Like they can become really complex, difficult texts to work your way through. So yes, hearing that Syed had a memoir, I'm like, oh, that gives me a way to access this. Like that's fantastic.